I want us to take a look at the image on the flyer for this presentation. So if you can put slide 1 up, just as a reminder. So you would have all seen this image on the advert for the talk, and it's quite a profound image. And I want you just to make, if you can make a personal note, just in your mind, about what the image raises for you, and what thoughts and feelings and questions do you have about the image? What do you see? What do you feel? And what could this image itself mean in terms of listening, supporting, facilitating, and sitting with? And what might you be sitting with in terms of history, culture, identities, white privilege, and racism, as you consider your response to this particular image, that I think has done justice to the theme in itself. Whilst holding a rich cultural heritage, the therapists may also be sitting with the pain of misunderstanding, denial, silence, shame, and rejection. And I can see all these feelings aptly portrayed in this image. So obviously there's a lot for discussion. But we're not going to discuss this particular image, but I just want you to pay attention to what it actually means in terms of your own relationship and responses to it. I want you all to be aware of intellectual copyright and confidentiality during this talk and during the discussion or questions that we may talk about afterwards. And I also want you to listen with a reflective and a reflexive ear, and listen with your heart. This is not really an intellectual exercise. It's a way of sharing and understanding our relationship in sitting with some of the issues that come up with regards to racism, intersecting experiences or identities. Okay, for some reason something came up on the chat. So I want to encourage people not to be writing on the chat while I'm speaking to you, because it's very distracting. And there's going to be a chance later to address and raise questions. So I want to tell you first a bit about my journey. So to give you some background into what I've had to sit with throughout my life as a therapist. In 1979, I started listening to black male teenagers behind a coffee bar in a youth club in Lewisham. They told me stories about absent fathers, mothers who were absent in other ways, such as having more than one job while trying to keep the home together, or being unwell due to being overburdened. One young man had been shot in the eye in a drugs maneuver. Another refused to go to school. Eventually, it became clear that more than just a listening ear was needed, as these young men were participating in symbolically burning down the village. They say that it takes a village to raise a child, and that if the child does not go through an appropriate rites of passage, they will burn the village down. In some ways, we can look at the Black Lives Matter protest as an attempt to burn down the dysfunctional village, and a way of drawing attention to lack of sitting with an appropriate gaze and lack of initiation of those who are not members of the white privileged group. After a while, I came out from behind the coffee bar and put some chairs in a circle so that these young men could sit and share, facing their particular isolation and mutual experiences of racism, emasculation, and oppression. We began to sit with some of their concerns about being marginalised and stigmatised by adults and white peers. This gave them some hope that there was a place where someone would sit with them and listen to their woes and their hopes and their dreams. It became a physical, mental, and emotional sitting with. I also offered them some acceptance of their feelings and socio-cultural designation as Black boys who felt that they had not been listened to. As time went on, I realised that there were people who were willing to listen to my own story, and this led to my training as a therapist and eventually a job as a lecturer in higher education. Along the way, I realised that I was being listened to only, in a sense, if the therapist and supervisors could interpret and attach Eurocentric theory to my experience. Of course, I had powerful feelings about this. And it became clear that they were unable to sit with my intersecting experience as a woman who also happens to be a Black woman. Can we have slide 2, please? So the 2 books that evolved during my practice so far came about as a result of finding my voice and sitting with the traumatic impact of racism in my professional and personal life. And I'm always aware that as Black people, as Black therapists, when we're working with clients of any designation, we're also sitting with the traumatic impact of racism on ourselves and between us and clients. My first book was called Black Issues in the Therapeutic Process, and this came out of the doctoral research that gave me a lot of information on the trainings that I was working on, gave me a lot of information about how there were great difficulties in facilitating students to sit with the experience of racism in the classroom and in their lives. And the second book was more about working with facing the challenge and how to explore, understand, and facilitate and engage with the challenge. So this was more about finding a voice to actually have a dialogue about the impact of racism. My curiosity about what was happening to Black students in the corridors of power came from remembering my own marginalisation as a therapist and student. I want to share a poem that I wrote to express my frustration during time as a lecturer and presenting Black Issues workshops to students that I worked with. The poem is called Invisible, and it came out of my experience of being marginalised as a Black lecturer and staff member in one of the particular universities that I decided to do the main elements of my research, which meant taking workshops on Black issues into the classroom to the students to get them to engage with the impact of racism. Invisible. They talk over my head, they lean across my desk, they stand beside me, they ask someone else. They ignore my request, they take it off the agenda, They try to convince me, they say it's my problem. They arrive after me, they queue behind me. They arrive after me, they stand in front of me, they queue behind me, they get served first. They turn their backs, they want to shake hands. They gave children guns, they stole my lands. They wounded my heart, they tortured my body. They blinded my heritage, they made the trail bloody. They show their tears, they want compassion. They carve their smiles, they follow fashion. They misinterpret my words, they don't want my opinion. They wear their guilt, they can't see I'm broken. They fail to hear me, they want me silenced. They shrink away, they call my power violence. They invite challenge, they leave me on the front line. They include me when they want a token. They say, show me how. They have their problems. They want it written, they don't want it spoken. They come for my soul, they have already taken. They want me the same, they make me different. They want to be conscious, they want to do it right. They want me visible, they want me out of sight. And this poem was written in 2002, and it was one of the ways that I expressed my tension, distress, and distaste for some of the experiences of racism that I had as a lecturer at that time, embarking on a doctoral research. So, yeah. So basically, what I want to say is that your story is just as important as mine, and the client's story is as important as yours. However, we need to be confident about listening to the whole story, whether or not it's being voiced. Slide 3, please. Therapies sometimes perpetrate judgmental and interpretive responses that suggest denial and silence in the context of racism, rather than sitting with the painful experience of racism. For example, we often hear things like, is it really happening? And then the person who's the victim of racism often feels there's something wrong with them, and sometimes even questions their mental health. Is it really happening? Misguided and misinterpreted responses cause rupture in the relationship, and we need to identify powerful feelings that distract from the client's personal story. One aspect of these responses is what I call the campaigner mode, or jumping on the bandwagon approach. And what happens there often is that the therapist identifies with the experience of racism as though it were their own, rather than the client's experience. And this is one of the kind of tricks of the trade, because many of us have been trained, including myself, in ways that don't encourage us to interrogate the impact of racism on ourselves when we're actually working with aspects of racism in the therapeutic alliance. So when we're doing this, if we're identifying and feeling powerful feelings about ending racism or campaigning, whilst we're working with a client, what are we doing? Because if we're not paying attention to the trauma of racism in all its guises, we may not be empathizing, or we may be becoming distracted by our own powerful feelings and unattended to own oppressions, a response to the racism, rather than sitting with the client and their intersecting identities and personal experience of racism that can exacerbate racism. So what I'm actually saying is that, and as a supervisor, I see this happening a lot. There's a response to the powerful experience of racism that can often happen, but then quite often empathizing stops because the therapist is in touch with their own feelings about racism, which are powerful and often unattended to. So we need to see empathy as a form of love, and that nothing can come between us and the client, not even a response about racism, unless we're going to use it in a healthy way to empathize with the experience of racism. And the intersecting aspect of this is that the client has their own story and their own other oppressions and ways of coping that come from their heritage because of the many identities that we have that also can get triggered when we're trying to work with the influence of racism. Very tricky. Can we have slide 4, please? Often the experience of racism gets marginalized and not fully attended to. And this is exactly what I'm trying to talk about. So Tuckwell, there's an interesting quote from Jill Tuckwell, who's a white woman, in a book called Racial Oppression and White People, I think it's called. The search for identity, which is common to both groups, and the symbolic representation of blackness and whiteness in the inner world is tightly interwoven with images and memories from colonial past, as well as current social realities. This leads to differences in the intrapsychic development of Black and white people as a result of the collective memory and experiences of oppression. The traditional white belief in Black inferiority and white superiority has had a particular function for white groups in obscuring the need to look more deeply at the unresolved feelings and issues about self and other. And many of us have not been trained in the best ways of doing this or supported in the best ways of doing it once we are trained. So what does sitting with this mean in the context of racism and intersecting oppressions? Are we checking judgmental interpretive responses, denial and silence in the context of racism? Are we sitting with awareness of clients' ways of coping with racism as an intersecting oppression? It's not just the one area of oppression that's happening. It means that many areas get triggered, and it also means that the client's way of coping is based on their personal development processes and the strengths and weaknesses of how they coped with oppression and hurt from their past. Can we have slide 5, please? So when I was doing the research for my doctoral study, I asked many groups of people, including the students I was working with, to put forward their questions about working with Black issues. And this is just a very, very small selection. Some of those questions are in the first book. Why do I feel nervous when I hear the term Black issues? Why do I feel more comfortable as a Black counsellor when presented with Black clients? Would I ever be seen as good enough as a white counsellor to deal with Black issues by a Black client? And how can I hold on to my sense of being Black in a white counselling world? I'm not saying that I answered these questions, but these questions are continuously raised by students, by practicing therapists, and even sometimes by supervisors. So I guess I'm thinking, what are your questions? And you know, think about what your questions are in this area. Can we have slide 6, please? So I use the word restimulation for what happens when a client is either talking about racism, or we know that they may have been subject to racism, white racism, due to the colour of their skin. And this kind of strong feeling that can come up for us in the relationship with the client, and even in supervisory relationships, I use the term restimulation because it brings up stuff in us, and that can cause a rupture in therapeutic relationship, because often whatever comes up is usually quite powerful. Often the voice of slavery and oppression puts people's backs up when discussed in psychological forums. It intrudes on the white therapist's persona with a legacy of guilt, and Black therapists may be reminded of the fear and loss associated with the pain and degradation of white supremacy. Can we have slide 7, please? So whilst I was doing the doctoral study and looking at ways to assist individuals to have a dialogue about racism in therapeutic process, and also to find frameworks to be able to discuss and have a dialogue, I created the concept of recognition trauma. And so I use this concept often because recognition trauma really is about the recognition that we have of our own feelings about racism and the experience of racism, and about the other oppressions that we feel hurt by, that are reenacted when we're thinking about racism. So with this concept, powerful feelings come to the fore. And I've created the concept in relation to the experience of racism. However, this concept can be applied, it's a model really, it can be applied to the situation of other oppressions, such as sexism, homophobia, transphobia. And suddenly these feelings come to the surface because we may either identify with the oppression, or we may identify with the oppressor. And what I found when working with the students and hearing the feelings that they were experiencing as a result of talking about racism within the student group and within their sociocultural experiences, was that there was either silence and denial or strong feelings of fear and rage. And whether they were expressed or not, on asking students afterwards what this was like for them, they would often come out and say either it was a white student who was afraid of being called the racist, or Black students who were then feeling powerful feelings of rage about the experiences of racism that they'd had. What's also apparent with recognition trauma is that it can prevent the therapist from sitting with their client's trauma about racism. So, for example, a therapist may be afraid to mention the word racism or to talk about the diversity or similarity between them. And so this can become a block and a rupture in the therapeutic process, because the feelings are then turned in to all the hurt from many oppressions that a therapist may have experienced. Can we have slide 8, please? So, as I mentioned earlier, the influences that give us the information we need when these hurts are coming to the surface are influenced by our own personal ways of coping, our upbringing, levels of internalized racism, how emerged we are from the trauma of racism, how many other strong oppressions we've experienced and how they intersect with the hurt of racism, in understanding and acceptance that racism exists. That's a level. How much do we understand about racism? How much do we believe that it exists? How much do we want to be part of changing and supporting, of change and supporting those who have experienced racism? How willing are we to address racism as an intersecting oppression, as one of many oppressions that individuals experience? And what support systems do we have so that we can be more willing to this ongoing process of working with the impact of racism? Can we have slide 9, please? Okay. So this is a challenge to institutional and individual racism, because we all need to be aware of our own roles in the history and institutions and social processes of inequality, which frequently confront us in cross-cultural work. Beyond this, for our part, we must avoid essentializing and totalizing our clients as Black subjects. This is Stuart Hall. And search for ways in which we may help them discover a range of representations of themselves, and in this way encourage a critical dialogue around personal politics. So basically I believe what's been said here is that working with a Black person is not just about them being a Black person, sitting with their history, the power of amazing historical and beautiful past, as well as the impact of racism in this area of the world in particular, and the impact of internalized racism in many other areas. It's also about remembering that the client has those many other parts, has those many other identities, and that the hurt of one can impact on the hurt of another. What I always say though is you cannot assume that because you have experienced one form of oppression, that gives you the empathy for the experience of another. So if you've experienced sexism, you can't assume that you understand and can empathize with racism. You may be able to empathize with hurt, but it's essential that the hurt of racism is attended to. At the same time, essentializing someone as just a black person is not sitting with them holistically in terms of the many other experiences of oppression. When essentializing occurs, the focus is frequently directed onto the experiences of racism with little understanding of the impact of social history on the personal development of both black and white therapists and clients. In this sense, the impact of slavery, colonialism, partition, caste systems, and indentured labour are all to be considered in the present climate of transcultural communication. However, historical factors of oppression should not be taken for granted as the main factors. Their underlying features of power, powerlessness, disenfranchisement, and liberation. We need to be aware of these and embrace the ancestral context of racism. The impact of collective colonial memory that Tuckwell refers to has been woven through counsellor training and has created a certain numbness and lack of voice in varying degrees for both black and white counsellors. This numbness has resulted in a general lack of voice in relation to black issues and the context of racism in therapists and client communication. Okay, so I want to share with you about my work with a client that I should call Jacinta. I've written about an interview with her in my first book. And after we finished our therapy, which lasted about 4 years, I think, I asked her to come back and speak to me about how she experienced the therapy with me. And I gained her permission to write about it in the book. So my work with Jacinta explained how the importance of a non-judgmental approach to intersecting identities can work. I used an integrative transcultural framework that included knowledge of the historical context of African Caribbean families and the concept of Black Western archetypes, which is another concept referred to in my books. To help my understanding of Jacinta's situation, I drew on some of the concepts that I had created as a kind of a framework. Jacinta was impacted by her mother's secretiveness and violence towards her. As a result of this, she hid from adults as a child and felt unable to show affection to her white female partner. For different reasons, yet linked to her intersecting oppressions as woman, Black, and gay, there was an element of disempowerment in her relationship with her mother and her partner. I called this ancestral baggage because what was happening to her had come from way back in her past, including the next generation with her experience of mother. She was writing a novel which featured a child being beaten, and through her therapy became conscious that her own experience was embedded in her writing. So when we first started to talk and she explained that she was writing this novel, she wasn't ready to admit that there was a part of her in this novel. She was also working through something. But by the time we finished the therapy, she realized that she'd put herself into the novel. She often looked sad, with her head leaning to one side, and assigned her power to me, expecting me to ask questions and offer resolutions. I saw this as kind of a feature of the black, what I call the Black Westerner archetype, you know, of handing over the power to someone else or power being taken. She suffered denial of her birth father and a negative gaze from her stepfather, coupled with the embarrassment this all caused her to believe that she had no right to be here. In Jung's terms, together we expose the archetypes. As her therapist, I held out the challenge of her ability to show herself to me without any threat to her physical or emotional being. This included sensitivity about her role in a diverse female relationship. Her partner was white, and her subservience to her mother. Shame and embarrassment related to her past was tentatively acknowledged during the interview, and she confirmed that my ability to reflect the significance of the beatings was a key element in her therapy. Holding out hope of her empowerment and ability to develop the role of initiator in the intimate communication between us as adults and as two Black women played a significant part in her recovery. So you can see the intersecting identities and experiences that we were sitting with. Through this process, her low self-esteem and difficulties in her relationship with her mother, her lover, and herself were repaired. So I'm going to read a little bit of the interview with Jacinta when she returned to discuss with me how she had experienced the therapy. She says, "Before I knew you, I guess I thought there would be more of a common experience if I went to a Black woman for counselling. I don't know if that is particularly true, because I read your book about searching for Mr. Mackenzie. It's a book that I wrote about my own search for my Black father's heritage. I think I liked that book because it was about a search for a father. That was one of the things I wanted to look at. But there's this thing about, if you mention about violence within the Black family, within a white context or outside of the Black conference, it seems to be open to being stereotyped. So it feels like I'm not always free to say what I really want to say. That's another thing that kind of stops me from saying what happened. So I'll jump to where we talk a bit more about the beatings. And I say to Jacinta, I remember when you told me that you were concerned about giving it the beatings, attention, because you have friends who've said that beatings have not done them any harm. I remember that I said that you are not your friends and asked what did it mean for you. And I remember there was a little difficulty because I challenged you for trivializing your own situation. And even though you were bringing it, you were not giving it much time. And she says, yes, let's move on to the next thing. And she laughs. But yeah, if I keep bringing it back, so obviously it means much more than I give it credit for. And I say to her, even now I can feel how sensitive the issue is and how important it was to me to connect with you. It seems as a Black woman on this issue. What you said to me about beatings being common in Black families, I know that. It is knowledge that I bring to my experience as a counsellor, but hearing you now confirms that my knowledge of that has been important, not just my knowledge of a stereotype, but also allowing it to be something that we explore. And she says, yeah. And I say, I'm also remembering that when I used the term abuse, it had a big impact on you. And she laughs. Yeah, yeah, because that's such a very strong word. Again, at the time, I would say it did not describe me. I am not one of those NSPCC children or the children you see occasionally on the television or in my work. But also just thinking about the use of that word, well, maybe it does apply to me. The other thing is thinking about my mother. She has both elements. She's a lot more complex than I want to make her, and she laughs. I want to make her simple, to be loving always. I don't want her to be this other side which is aggressive, violent, or I can't quite acknowledge that all the time or settle with these two kind of extremes of being with her. But I do feel like that when I apply that there has been abuse and violence done to me, then I feel like I'm accepting my experience, but I'm also accepting my mum as she is. I'm not trying to idealize her. I'm making her more real and making my experience more real for myself. That can only be good, because if I keep denying that, even though I have not talked to her about her abuse, our relationship has got better. Through our counselling sessions, I feel like at some point I could talk to her, whereas there was no way I felt that I could approach her. There is now the possibility of me opening to questioning her or finding out more about her own experience. Hopefully, maybe at some point, it won't come out as blame. It will be something to explore as well. And so you can see interweaved within that conversation the intersectionality and intergenerational context of what had happened to this client in terms of her relationship with her mother, with her, there was a lot more to this, with her stepfather, and with her white female partner. And weaved within that were the intersecting oppressions and the intersecting experiences that she was bringing to me. Okay, so I'm just wondering what everyone's thinking at the moment. And basically, I think what I want to do now is summarize what I've been talking to you about and to give you some time to have thoughts on this and formulate your questions. So I started by sharing some of my own journey, and I talked about the coffee bar that acted as a barrier to the young Black teenagers, male teenagers that I was listening to. There was listening, but isolation was intact, and we came out from behind the coffee bar and made greater connection by sitting with each other. I shared with you a little bit about the oppression within my own training and my experience of emerging from institutional and personal racism, which is ongoing, and how through this I found my voice. And one of the ways I found my voice was by sharing my experiences through writing. And I guess this is why I'm here today. And from that, I have been enabling others to break isolation and find their voice. And basically, I want to leave you with a question to attend to. So what needs to happen for therapists to safely sit with the impact of racism? What is your personal responsibility for change in attitude and process? Because when I present these talks, I don't want people to be just sitting and listening and agreeing or disagreeing and just hearing me say things. The purpose of me doing this talk is to give you enough reflection to take the information away and think about your own practice and your own need for support in working in this area, and remembering that we're all sitting with this journey of the challenge of racism